We can now bring in Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as a former State Department analyst. Thank you very much for joining us here on the program today. You've been a former negotiator under the Republican and Democratic administrations in the United States. Based on what you're seeing, will we get a ceasefire given that Israeli officials are hell-bent on an offensive in Rafah?
The question is whether or not Israel and Hamas feel enough urgency in order to overcome the obstacles. I think there's a reasonable chance because I think Hamas feels under greater pressure, and perhaps the Israelis do as well, that something could come out of this in the next week or two.
How much leverage does the United States have over Israel, given that Washington has so far been unsuccessful in getting more aid into Gaza?
On paper, it has an extraordinary amount of leverage. It could slow walk, restrict, or condition U.S. military assistance. It could change its voting posture in New York, or it could call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. The president has chosen not to do any of these things because I think he's persuaded, not just because of his emotional commitment to Israel, but I think he's persuaded that the only way to change the pictures in Gaza, the only way to surge humanitarian assistance and get a cessation of hostilities, even if it's only temporary, is by cooperating and pushing the Israelis without causing a major crisis. If he goes to a major crisis, I think the Israelis are perfectly prepared. This Israeli government, the most extreme and right-wing in Israel's history, is perfectly prepared to resist. So I think the administration is trying to play this out. If it turns out there's no deal this time around, and the Israelis are still threatening to launch an imminent operation ground campaign in Rafah, I think the U.S.-Israeli relationship is going to get worse.
But there is a humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. Even Antony Blinken just the other day said 100% of the enclave is food insecure.
It's absolutely the case. In fact, people are using terms, technical terms like famine or catastrophic starvation. And there's clearly a lot more, no doubt, that this Israeli government can do to facilitate assistance. The problem is it is virtually impossible under current circumstances to get the kind of assistance in a sustained and prolonged basis without a cessation of hostilities. It's not just getting the aid into Gaza, it's distributing the aid within Gaza. And we've seen what happens when, in fact, you have a convergence of lawlessness. The only way to fix the humanitarian assistance issue is to get a cessation of hostilities.
There are around 100 hostages still in Gaza. Does their presence there change the calculus for Israel at all?
I think the hostage factor has fundamentally created and separated these negotiations from any negotiations, certainly that I ever participated in the Arab-Israeli arena. The hostages are Hamas's ultimate leverage to survive. The hostages present a amplification and a radicalization, tremendous pain for the people of Israel, puts the government under tremendous pressure, and creates a situation where you have Israeli military objectives, in essence, being in conflict with the redemption of its own citizens. So yes, the hostage issue is critically important. It may not be the most important issue, but it is right now, along with humanitarian assistance, the most urgent one.
But Mr. Miller, I want to jump in there because you're saying the hostage issue is one of the key factors that Israel has in its mind, but at the same time, we have Israeli officials that have restricted the flow of aid into Gaza. Presumably, some of that food aid that is going in will be used to feed the hostages. So why are they doing it?
No, I don't think that's the calculation. I think the calculation on the part of this government is that they're under tremendous pressure from much of the public not to provide any assistance, whether it's diverted to Hamas or not, as long as Hamas continues to hold and continues to abuse hostages. There are 134 hostages that Hamas controls, 31 of whom the Israelis are persuaded were either killed on October 7th, bodies brought back to Gaza to trade, or they died in captivity. I interviewed former Prime Minister Ehud Barak yesterday, His calculation is that half of the 134 hostages are no longer alive. So the pressure on the Israeli government to avoid surging humanitarian assistance while Hamas holds the hostages is, I think, the predominant challenge, plus the logistics. Again, getting the aid to Gaza is one thing. Distributing it in a safe and secure manner, getting it to where it belongs is right now, I think, the more difficult problem.
The fact that Washington and Israel cannot agree on what happens in Gaza the day after this war finishes, does that change these current negotiations right now?
I think it poses a huge problem. It's not just the Israelis and the Americans who can't agree. There's very little Arab state buy-in right now on this, and the Palestinian House, understandably, is in tremendous disorder. I mean, a revitalized Palestinian Authority with Mahmoud Abbas, 88 years old, in the 19th year of a 4-year term, under tremendous pressure, with no credibility, largely and partly, of course, because of his own corruption, but also as a consequence of Israeli efforts to annex the West Bank in everything but name, has created a situation where you do not have a legitimate Palestinian governing structure. And how do you legitimize it? You have elections, but the odds that elections could be held in the West Bank or Gaza right now, chances of that slim to none. So the day after and the day after the day after is going to prove critically important to whether or not Gaza can have a degree of security and prosperity that it's so long been denied.